This video presents content from Chapter 4 of the book, Sustainable Living and World Peace, from a section entitled, Secretary of Peace. Having a Secretary of Peace and/or a Department of Peace has been considered by many people before. There have even been some serious initiatives mounted in the past toward officially establishing such an office. Regardless of what others envisioned as appropriate tasks and duties for such an office, this section will present some ideas as to what benefits could be gained by having a Secretary of Peace and how a Secretary of Peace may function in our efforts toward world peace. First of all, effectively directed in accordance with our PAL virtue, a Secretary of Peace would get more done toward advancing national security than a Secretary of Defense ever could, or the Department of Homeland Security, and achieve this greater success at a much lower cost. Do you see how having a Secretary of Peace could change our entire mindset of peaceful and sustainable relationships? Do you see how our associations with other peoples and nations could be affected, how the entirety of our relationships with other peoples and nations could change? Not only would our input and participation in relationships change, our having a Secretary of Peace would influence how others approach their relationship with us and with other nations and peoples. There is power in symbolism and in effectively directed words that can influence people's decisions, behaviors, and entire ways of life. Symbolism and words can be very powerful when they clearly indicate enduring intentions and interests, especially when they originate from an unmistakably virtuous position. A Secretary of Peace would be an unmistakable symbol of our nation's wishes for peace, sustainability, and prosperity. At one time, the United States had a Secretary of War, but has had a Secretary of Defense since 1947. Having a Secretary of War was a definite symbol, and using the word war in the name of the office projected a certain image of the office and of the United States. Having the word defense in the office's title does, in effect, change the symbol to a certain degree. However, the office's purpose is still understood as occupying the same position and essentially, at least in spirit, filling the role of its predecessor but under a different name and in a different organized system. Countries around the world have similar offices, although they may have varying roles related to their nation's armed forces. That includes such titles as Defense Minister, Minister of Defense, Secretary of National Defense, and Secretary of State for Defense. Even though the word war does not appear in their titles, no matter what name is given to them, it is understood that they have a prominent position of power and authority in their nation's war machines. The existence of these offices truly is a symbol for each country, and this simple symbol has meaning to us all. The fact that so much eminence is given to such an office in nations around the world sends a message of intentions and expectations that appears almost inescapable due to its overwhelming presence. We definitely have a persistent and omnipresent symbol of war given to us by governments of the world. What has been missing within governments throughout the world is a deliberate and transcending symbol of peace. Also missing are words of persistent hope, facilitation, and pursuit of peace. The Secretary of State is primarily concerned with the foreign affairs of the nation and does pursue diplomatic solutions to conflicts and disagreements. However, when trying to establish and portray the interests of the United States in any conflict or disagreement, this Secretary often utilizes the same bullying, meddling, provoking, and propagandistic tactics that the United States has become so accustomed to portraying to the world. Consequently, the effectiveness of the Secretary of State has become limited, and the outcomes of his or her work often leads to inadequate solutions. In addition, peaceful and prosperous diplomatic efforts are currently sporadic at best and often unproductive when initiated because no one is able to focus on them or do what is needed to move them forward without distraction of purpose. It was mentioned earlier in the chapter that special systems and processes may need to be created that will help us establish and then maintain peace. The Secretary of Peace will be part of such a system and would be a helper in processes for peace to be established and perpetuated. Being a country based on virtue and the belief that all people are created equal with certain unalienable rights, there is great potential for a Secretary of Peace to make great strides in the advancement of world peace, perceived equitable solutions, and more constructive national security. Some of his or her tasks would be to more clearly project our values and virtues to the world and convey to others what receiving the benefits of our values and virtues would mean to them. The Secretary of Peace would work with the Secretary of State and other departments to resolve conflicts in an overall movement toward a goal of world peace. The office may even somehow exist outside of government or work alongside the government and do these things. His or her approach to conflicts would be much more palatable to counterparts weary of the ways the United States has recently been carrying out diplomacy. Current diplomatic efforts carried out by the Secretary of State that have goals and desires of peaceful outcomes often get bogged down partly because of their other duties and agendas of the Secretary of State distract from what it would take to really progress toward peace. A Secretary of Peace would be able to keep a meaningful peace processes moving forward by making sure everyone holds a positive affirmation of peace and that everyone remains engaged and on track toward meaningful, peaceful resolutions. Additionally, he or she would seek to maintain respectful levels of trust toward all and look to eliminate perceived threats parties feel coming from other parties. The Secretary of Peace's message and methodology would do more to acknowledge and satisfy the needs for independence and freedom, both for sovereign nations and individuals. He or she will look to spread virtue, empathy, understanding, and compassion. His or her message would more easily extend overseas as he or she tries to solve problems while being guided by the belief that it is important to keep the best interests of individual humans in mind in a peacemaking process. His or her message would be appealing to people of all nations and all nations as sovereign entities. He or she would be committed to peace, unwavering in commitment of peace between one person and another, one nation and another, without fail. The Secretary of Peace would fully believe in and ensure the people that there is a peaceful and virtuous solution to every situation and problem. It must be pointed out that being committed to peace and peaceful solutions does not mean being a pacifist or being willing to achieve peace at any price. For instance, there would have been nothing to gain toward sustainable living and world peace by being nice to Nazi Germany as long as they were pursuing an authoritarian government that proclaimed the notion of wanting to dominate based on racial supremacy. No one should ever accommodate for or capitulate to perpetuators of violence and ignorance, or any group unyielding in support of an ideology that adheres to spreading through violence. Additionally, we must be wary that another party may be disingenuous in their cooperative efforts and covertly or overtly try to seek a strategic or military advantage while others are genuinely trying to work cooperatively toward peace. It would be difficult for some to pursue efforts toward demilitarization while others continue to build up militarily, consequently making themselves more of a perceived threat to others. Inviting a peace process should never be allowed to be like inviting a Trojan horse into your midst, thus setting up a situation where parties with devious intentions are able to let loose an imposing or controlling scheme over other countries. The Secretary of Peace should be cautious to not be a stooge for those using peace processes as a smokescreen to advance unscrupulous agendas. Nevertheless, we must be committed to resolving and overcoming the reasons for violent conflict and the escalation of tensions, and the Secretary of Peace would be a great facilitator of world peace through virtue and mutual respect for all. National security is paramount, as is the preservation of our way of life. There can be no compromising of either. Still, we must always trust in our hope of establishing and maintaining peaceful relationships with all people and all nations. As we strive for completely peaceful relationships, we must always realize that relationships are a two-way street, as mentioned earlier. However, how we present ourselves to the world and how we treat and interact with peoples of the world and other nations will greatly influence how they relate to us and respond in conflicts to us. We should not look to continue to fight fire with regards to our international relationships when the firefight continuously leads us ignorantly away from world peace, prosperity, and sustainability. We should not look to fight the fire of runaway militarization, political coercion, and distorted propaganda with more of the same. We instead should look to fight this fire with undeniable truths based on our values and virtues to resultantly awaken a virtuous response from other people. It was mentioned in the previous section of the book that you get what you bring to any relationship. We must ensure that we do not unnecessarily cause problems and elicit negative responses to conflicts from our counterparts because we were not presenting to the world the good that makes us great. Our commitment to peace and peaceful solutions requires our resolve and to have all parties to resolve to find a peaceful and sustainable solution to our conflicts, no matter what happens or how long it takes. Parties involved in the conflict should never be allowed to give up, and they need to remain confident that there is a solution that is peaceful to every conflict. Inasmuch as it is important that the Secretary of Peace not be thought of as an appeaser or a pacifier, the Secretary of Peace should also not look as if he or she were trying to promote a propaganda scheme that is misleading or disingenuous. The Secretary of Peace should be a committed trust and relationship builder and needs to be able to ensure that all parties believe in peaceful outcomes. He or she would be a person responsible for seeing from different perspectives and being insightful in people's interests when problem solving. He or she would be good at analyzing a conflict, being an active listener, and establishing and maintaining constructive dialogue. The Secretary of Peace would instill confidence in others that everyone is being treated with respect. All parties should feel that their freedom to choose, their opportunity for self-determination without interference, and their sovereignty are respected. For certain, when there is an ongoing conflict, the Secretary of Peace needs to keep everyone involved committed to peace, a peace process, and a peaceful resolution no matter how long it takes. However, once peace is achieved, it must be maintained actively with proper communication, trust, and commitment. All relationships require effort for them to work out, and the Secretary of Peace will still remain vigorous in maintaining good relationships and trust during times when relationships appear to be in good shape. As we have seen in our associations with other countries, our relations have often been allowed to worsen over time after we began to see progress toward more peaceful relations. We have seen that relationships can get better or worse over time, such as what has happened over time with Russia and China, but we should always be progressing toward ever better and improving relations. It seems that once relationships are allowed to slip into negative momentum, that a period of escalating armament, diplomatic withdrawal, and heightened stress unnecessarily occurs, which can then affect other nations and interested parties. A Secretary of Peace would help maintain a positive course that would discourage relationships from being allowed to fluctuate between good and bad times repeatedly. It is time for us to consider what could be gained in terms of national security, human well-being, and prosperity by having a Secretary of Peace. Then pursue steps to create such an office for the good of our country and all of humanity. In the past, when there was the threat of war breaking out, there has been the concern that it would spread or threaten to spread in an extending hostile environment. In a similar manner, but in this case driven by virtue, if sincerely meaningful peace were to break out, it would spread and potentially gain momentum on its own. Those not involved in the initial peace would realize they are being left out and are missing out on something big, and not just the benefits of the environment of peace, but also the associated prosperity that it brings. The United States has been a great leader in the world in so many regards. Now it is time for the United States to secure the means to lead and be first in initiating and carrying through a global peace initiative. Creating the office of a Secretary of Peace would be a great step forward in our efforts toward sustainable living and world peace.